Oh, um, we're just kind of sitting here, aren't we? Just kind of waiting for what the next curveball is going to be. Uh, it's the president's trip to China. You get two different stories depending on who you're listening to. The conditions in Iran and whether the war is going to start again this week, which I think it is. You get two different opinions. I have a conversation with a very dear friend of mine yesterday. He's a brother of another mother, and just absolutely opposite, absolutely opposite the viewpoints of what's going on around the planet. And this is an above intelligent person, above the average intelligence, but listens primarily to one source. And listening to one source, you can miss an awful lot of what's going on. Obviously, I try to engage many sources to be able to produce something here that will add to all of our understanding of what's going on around the planet, especially in the sense of our family, our home and family, and what we can expect to come down the pike. Because as I listen to these sources, even if Trump were to go ahead and declare victory, and I think he's just waiting for the Iranians to say, here's the 60% enriched material. The Russians are going to come and get it. The Russians will watch over it for us. In fact, we're just going to give it to the Russians. Then I think Trump can declare victory for this 3-month war now and go home. Now, obviously, we're at a very crucial strategic crossroad, and humanity can go in either one of two fundamentally different directions. There is the hopeful one, and I think that was hinted at the state visit of Trump in China, where he was, as the news says, warmly received, although he was not received by Xi Jinping. He was received by the vice president. And they agreed to improve the relationship among the two largest economies. They talked for 2 days. Xi Jinping kind of didn't read Trump the Riot Act, but before there was any discussion of anything, as I'm sure you know by now, the president of China told the president of the United States, hands off Taiwan. We're not going to be talking about Taiwan. We're not going to have anything to do in the next 2 days' discussion with Taiwan. Just forget it. There's other things that we need to talk about. And obviously, the strategic minerals that we depend upon China for, and the Iran war. So here you have the two largest economies, the largest one being China, the second largest one being the United States, trying to work for their mutual benefit, solving all these problems through negotiations and diplomacy, guided by Xi Jinping's conception that we have a shared future of mankind, and that there's only one future for the human species. The other one, of course, the other path besides some kind of agreement with China is going to be the path of escalation, which in the very short term could lead to a global nuclear war and annihilation of the human species. And it's very clear that if this unprovoked war of aggression against Iran is going to continue, we're facing the danger of the whole world economy plunging into a deep depression. And that there is also the policy of the coalition of the willing, basically saying the war with Russia is inevitable, but then that's a separate discussion from what I wanted to talk about today. Now, the Pentagon says that the cost of the first 60 days of this war was $25 billion. Now, if you calculate the actual cost It's more than 100 times that. It's more like 4 trillion if you count everything. If you count the military cost, the energy cost, the price of energy, the price of fertilizer, the reduction in production, the reduction of industrial and agricultural output, and the destruction of civilian infrastructure and assets, it's more like 4 trillion. So where do we go from here? Well, first of all, the United States and Israel have not accomplished one of the goals that they set out to win. And with all the braggadocio that's coming out of the Oval Office regarding our victories in the Iran war, who still controls the Strait of Hormuz? So, what the United States and Russia set out to do, not one of their goals, as I said, had been attained. They've not succeeded in decapitating the Iranian leadership. They've not eliminated the ballistic missile capability. They've not been able to cut the link in the forces of resistance or spread around the whole Gulf. And the whole world is not missing this point, that the strongest military force on earth was not able to defeat a middle-sized country. Also, the Strait of Hormuz, which was open before, is now basically under the control of Iran, which has set up a toll booth system. Who could blame them? So the options that we're looking at now are really pretty simple. Firstly, if the United States keeps this blockade going on against Iran, the time factor works clearly against us, clearly against the United States, because Iran will be more resilient. Iran is more resilient. Trump is already losing his own MAGA base, and he has to think about the upcoming midterms. This is not to the advantage of Trump. The Wall Street Journal proposes a second option, namely to have a continuation of the blockade as well as in resuming the bombing. But in all likelihood, Iran would be able to withstand such a situation. They have so far. I mean, even according to Western media reports, Iran still has 90% of its missile sites. That one spot there just south of Isfahan that is almost pounded daily by missiles. And some of the locals who live in that area said, yeah, we see the missiles coming in every day. And then every night we see the missiles going back out of the ground towards Israel. So they still, according to many sources, they still retain 90% of their missile sites, launch sites, while our arsenal is almost depleted. 1,100 long-range stealth cruise missiles have been deployed. That's almost the total supply of what the United States had. 1,000 Tomahawk missiles have been used, which is about 10 times what the Pentagon is able to produce in 1 year. And they even had to divert weapons from Asia, which obviously weakens the focus on the Pacific, which according to various doctrines was the priority anyway. Now there's also the possibility that Iran, if the bombing resumes, is going to retaliate. Even with this so-called ceasefire that's going on, there's been bombing of Iran, but Iran hasn't done anything. A little bit here and there, but not much. Which brings us up to what Iran is threatening to do now. This will have enormous cost, not only for the United States bases in the region, but also in the countries that are hosting those U.S. bases. Samer, I'll get to that. Because the business model in any case has been to destroy the American bases, and if they haven't already been partially destroyed, they've been severely damaged. The third option is that Trump will try to get a deal with Iran, which is probably in his own best interest because he's looking for this off-ramp. But that goes against the fact that both the Israelis and the Israeli lobby in our country do not want to deal with Iran under any circumstance, because they regard Iran, for reasons right or wrong, as an existential threat to Israel. And remember, since the vast majority of our representation in Congress, both the House and the Senate, are employees of Israel through AIPAC, it's pretty easy to figure out what's going to take place here. However, there is a discussion right now in the IDF and also in the intelligence services in Israel. Whoa, something's playing. Something's playing at KTalk. That the present policies, if they're continued, represent a very real threat to the existence of Israel. Now, I want you to just think for a moment here. What has been the principal targets of Iran? Iran's attack on Israel and the American bases. What was the first line of attack? What was the first line of targets that Iran was going against when this thing broke out February 28th? Was all of the defense tracking equipment, the radar stations, the big radars, the radar stations there at Bahrain, the big $1 billion unit. One missile is all it took to take out $1 billion system that tracks the entire Middle East area. And they hit American bases, they hit supply depots at American bases, they hit runways at American bases. And then they didn't do too much after that. In Israel, they attacked defense areas. Wherever they were housing their tanks, their jeeps, their missile launchers, airplanes, that was the primary target. Now, what is coming out of Iran, and I hear this from Agrachi, and I hear this from Morandi when they're speaking, the next round of attack is essentially going to go for the heart. Not the business district of Tel Aviv or Haifa. What they're going to be going for would show up in three various phases. And the first phase is to go to, let me back up. I'm getting ahead of myself. When you're fighting a war like this, and what I'm about to tell you is what I have learned from listening to war experts, those who've actually fought on the front lines. And of course, the major one is the Iraq War, what we learned about fighting in the Middle East from the Iraq War. Also, what we've learned in Afghanistan, what we learned in Vietnam, is that there is a certain logistical support that has to be in place for forward troops to move, for them to be rearmed, for them to be fed. Soldiers whose bellies are empty don't make the same decisions they make when their bellies are full. And so you have to be able to supply artillery, ammunition, you have to supply food and water, you have to supply clothing, you have to supply all the things that would keep your house running for a week or two. You've got to have that same stuff on the front lines. And those things come from various routes. They come from highways, they come from airplane deliveries, they come from helicopter deliveries, they come from railway deliveries. But all of these things have to keep flowing to the front lines and to the missile centers. And if you were to interrupt the flow, the logistical support to the front line, where they run out of bullets, they run out of anti-tank missiles, they run out of anti-missile missiles, They run out of water. They run out of food. They run out of medical supplies. They run out of mobile hospitals. Then you've got a different situation than just sending in a bunch of missiles for a big bang and a big explosion and a big conflagration to try to scare the public into forcing their government to stop the war. Now you're going for the throat. And that's going to be the next phase that may start this week. In fact, I think it's going to start this week. It's been delayed long enough. And what they're going to go for. Have you been to Alameda, Oakland, Southern California, to any of the big docks, DOCKS, where transports are loaded and unloaded, and those big giant cranes that unload those big boxes are on those big ships that transport goods? Well, there are ships that come into Haifa with those containers that are loaded with armament. They're loaded with fuel. They're loaded with ammunition. They're loaded with the kind of supplies that I was talking about. If you take out those cranes, you're not going to unload the ship. If you don't unload the ship, there's going to be a critical logistical support deficiency. I think that's what's going to happen next. I think Iran now is going to go for the throat. That's what they're going to do, is bomb the ports. So the ports cannot unload supply ships coming in. Now, how else do you supply a war front besides ships? Especially not a place like, on one side or the other of the Dnieper River in Ukraine, where you've got solid ground. I mean, we're coming out of winter where the ground was frozen and it was easy to move supplies. We're at the point now, we're in the mud section now, where it's not so easy to move stuff. But when you're sitting there in Israel and you're sitting right there on the edge of the ocean, there aren't a whole lot of train lines coming into Israel. A lot of highways. So that's where you have the C5s, the C-17s, the big transport airplanes that can haul not as much as these transport ships do coming into the Haifa port, but these big airplanes can haul a lot of ammunition. They can haul a tank or tanks. They can haul armored vehicles. They can haul hundreds of soldiers. They haul food. They haul medic supplies. They haul fuel. And these things are only operational if you've got a place to land them. So the Ben Gurion Airport has some long runways. Iran hasn't attacked those runways yet. And those long runways would allow these huge jets to come in and unload what they might be stopped at the ports of Haifa from being able to unload because Iran took out those cranes. Well, you don't have to destroy the Ben Gurion Airport. All you have to do is put a couple of holes in the long runways. And then the other airport that's just south of Ben Gurion, I forget the name, has a couple of runways that are long enough for the big transports. You put a couple of holes in that runway. You don't have to destroy the infrastructure. You don't have to take out all the airport. You don't have to take chances of killing a lot more innocent people. You just make it impossible for those transports to land. Then what else do you have? If you can't unload at the ports, you can't unload at the airport. Well, there's some railways. There's some railway lines coming in from the north that have been protected both by Lebanese, Syrian, American forces, Russian forces. Remember, there's over 1 million Russian-speaking people in Israel. And Putin isn't too wild about seeing death and destruction come to these Russian-speaking Israelis, and has tried to intervene on their behalf. But I think this is what you're going to see now. And then there's a third phase, not just the ports, not just the runways, the air support, the bridges. Bridges have been left, a few of them have been hit, but most bridges have been left untouched. So if you cut off the sea, you cut off the air, you cut off the bridges, so that whatever is on the front line cannot be resupplied. And one of the best estimates that I saw said that the front line, both in Lebanon and in Israel, the front line, it's not like they're under a ground attack, but it's the front line that protects the rest of it behind them, has 4 to 5 days of supplies. Same thing in the Ukraine. The Russian forces, the Ukrainian forces, have about 4 to 5 days of supplies at any one time, should the supply be cut off from behind them. Well, the Russians don't seem to have any problems with that because they're being well supplied, because they continue to move anywhere up to 40 kilometers a day. I mean, there's not a whole lot of space left before they hit the Dnieper River. And Russia just set in a massive attack on Kyiv, 1,500 drones, I think it was. And Ukraine sent in a whole mess of drones into Russia, killing some Russian citizens. But I just want you to keep this in mind, because the next round, the next firing of missiles back and forth, I don't know what the United States and Israel has planned any more than I know what the Iranians have planned, except when you think about it, it begins to be obvious, at least in my mind, what Iran has to do now. And they have to get really serious, and they have to stop the war-making ability of Iran. And in so doing, it's not just armaments that will be interrupted at the port. Food, medical supplies for the citizens of Israel. It's not just armament that won't be able to land in the big transports because of a hole or two in the runways. And I'm talking about big holes. Holes big enough you can put your house in it. It's supplies for the Israeli citizens. Food, water, medical supplies, and all the other things that are involved with maintaining life. I mean, just look at your own life over the last week. What was required for you to live over the last week? A roof over your head, gasoline for your vehicles, food for the table, pharmaceuticals for those that need them, and some people really need them. And what else? All the little kinds of things that were going on involving the adults, involving children, involving school, involving work over the last week. If the fuel wasn't there, what would have happened to your life this last week if not only gasoline got to $12, $15 a gallon, what if there wasn't any? What if it was rationed? What if you could only get gas on the days that, I don't know, where your name falls in the alphabet, maybe. And then you'd be checked with your driver's license at the gas pump. And then you'd only be allowed 10 gallons or so, which gas prices at that point, that's all you can afford. Now, I'm not saying that's going to happen here. I'm saying that's going to happen in Israel if Israel and the United States launches another attack on Iran, because I can only see Iran responding in this fashion. It will be the end of Israel. So, despite the fact that we have obliterated their nuclear program and we've completely destroyed their Air Force and completely destroyed their Navy, as President Trump says, and Hegseth says, they still have 90% of their missiles. And their missiles still come out of the ground at night in areas that are being pounded by B-2 and other air bombing raids in various places in Iran. But Iran, remember what Iran has been doing since the overthrow of the Shah. Was that 47 years ago, if I remember right, something like that? They have been building underground caverns, underground missile silo storage material. They've been storing missiles. They've been storing drones. They've been storing fuel because they knew this was coming. So imagine yourself in Israel with all of a sudden your ports are taken out so the things can't be unloaded or loaded. Your airport runways, even commercial flights now, emergency flights, would have to be limited to smaller aircraft for the shorter runways. I don't think Iran would take out all the runways. They'll just take out the ones that the big transports need. The ones that are, a mile and a half to 2 miles long. Those transports need a lot of ground speed to get off that ground. The bridges that would isolate you to a certain area to be taken out. I don't think they're going to take out much of the power systems because the hospitals need it. And the basic supply to the Israeli citizens of food and water and hospitalization, I don't think the Iranians would do that. I think that's a war crime. Now, Israel and the United States have certainly done that against the Iranians. But I just want you to think about that because I think that's what's going to happen next. And then all of a sudden, you're going to see Netanyahu asking for a ceasefire. Just like July of last year, the so-called 12-day war. On day 7, Netanyahu was asking for a ceasefire because they didn't expect Iran to respond like they did. Now, when you have intelligence gathering on the level that the Mossad represents, and the CIA represent, and MI6 represent, how could you miss that? And so here, the same thing since February 28th. They weren't expecting this kind of response. They really, as silly as it seems, they really thought in the initial stages of this war that the citizens would turn against their government, when the exact opposite happened. And now they're even more emboldened because they don't have a problem with martyrdom. I don't know if that's a part of I don't know that that's a part of the Islamic faith. There, different factions, just as there's different factions of Christians, from hardcore nutcases to those who really want to rebuild and have a wonderful, productive, loving society. So we should also consider that while Trump is trying to sound more peaceful, only a few weeks ago, he did threaten the complete annihilation of the entire Iranian civilization. Where's this coming from? I mean, in any case, if option 1 or 2, option 1, world peace, option 2, world annihilation, would be pursued, the danger is that the world economy could very easily plunge into a depression, which would lead to famine. It would lead to chaos. It would lead to a dark age like the 14th century. And already the World Food Program is saying that as a result of this war, 45 million more people are in acute hunger than ever before. This is why you have to very strongly want to see the adoption of a new security and developmental architecture that has to take into account the interests of every single country on this planet, which of course is what the bannerhead of BRICS is saying. That's what they're offering the world. Now, the danger is that if you look at the situation in Iran as it is right now, on the verge of another round of attacks, if it escalates, there is the danger of the use of nuclear weapons. We know Israel has them. We also know since 2003, when a fatwa was issued by Ali Khamenei, that Iran would never, ever build a nuclear weapon. Then we take him out, we murder him, along with children and grandchildren. That didn't stop the fatwa. It was still in place. No nuclear weapons. Tulsi Gabbard, 2 years ago, or was it, I think it was, maybe it's just a year ago when she came out with all of the intelligence sources that we have inside our government saying Iran is not building a nuclear weapon, neither do they have the capability of doing so. And President Trump says, I don't care what she said. Do you think they built one now? I would lay money on it. I would lay money on the fact that they've got a dozen of them probably by now that can be mounted on that Khorram Shah missile that cannot be shot down. Now, I don't want to see that. I don't want to see the world go in that direction any more than you do. But when Trump talks about the complete annihilation of the Persian civilization, out of one side of his mouth, and then out of the other side of the mouth, says we're winning the war over there, and it's only a matter of time before they finally surrender. Where's this man coming from? Now, the coalition of the willing and the Anglo-Americans have already assisted Ukraine in crossing the red lines against Russia. The first time was the territorial invasion in Kursk. The second time, the attack on one leg of the strategic triad of Russia, the early warning missile systems, remember? And the third time when the attempted decapitation of Putin by attacking his residence. Now, this last action was denied by Western media, but Russia has provided video materials proving the case, to which Russian analyst and strategic expert Karaganov has answered, proposing that Russia should use a couple of nuclear weapons against the Europeans so that they remember the fact that Russia is the strongest nuclear power on the planet. Well, what a way to demonstrate it. In other words, enough red lines have been crossed by the West allies, the coalition of the willing, that Russia could do something like that. Now, if you take these two immediate dangers, there's no such thing, in my view, contrary to what Karaganov is saying, as a limited nuclear war. You don't just launch 2 nukes. And where would you launch them? What would be the target? Kyiv? Couple of places in Germany where these missiles are being assembled. Now, the eminent expert Ted Postel has said in many presentations why the use of only one nuclear weapon within a matter of 5 days would still lead to a global nuclear war, which is why the world must move in a completely different direction. with a completely new paradigm, and that is in the tradition of the Peace of Westphalia. That you have to consider the interest of the other, in this case, of all others. So you have to sit down at a table with Israel and Iran and the United States and some of the Gulf states and sit there and talk as adults that considers the needs and the concerns and the security of the other, not just yourself. Is Israel capable of doing that? I don't think so. Now, the concept is peace through development. It's an old idea which was promoted by Pope Paul VI in his encyclical back in 1967, Populorum Progressio, which says that every nation must be allowed to fulfill its entire interest. So when you look at the 10 principles that have been proposed for how this discussion would be taken into account, the 10 principles proposed by Helga LaRouche. She proposed 10 principles on how this discussion could. It's essentially making the world land bridge the concept of development for all countries. For Africa, it would mean joint investments by the West and the BRICS countries into development of Africa, according to the Africa 2063 plan. It would include the OASIS plan for Southwest Asia. Because if you look at a map of Southwest Asia, you're going to see it's just all desert. So they propose an approach to take the entire region from India to the Mediterranean, from the Caucasus to the Gulf, and build a system of canals, starting with a canal from the Mediterranean to the Dead Sea, using space technology to find the underground lakes and aquifers, using the ionization of moisture in the atmosphere, and essentially replicate what China just a few days ago published with a spectacular video that was called How China Turned Barren Desert into Massive Farmland, Producing Millions of Tons of Food. They propose a system of corridors connecting the existing CPEC corridor from China to Pakistan and the north-south transport corridor from St. Petersburg to India, and connected from Iran to Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Israel, Palestine, and finally Egypt. And that way make the Southwest Asian area the hub between Asia and Africa and Europe, as it used to be during the period of time of the ancient Silk Road. But you're going to have adults in the room for this to happen. You have to abandon the idea of geopolitics, the idea that there's a legitimate interest or one nation or group of nations whose interest outranks another group of nations. And then you kind of have to replace that with a love for mankind. Am I crazy? Am I crazy to even suggest the possibility that there are enough adults in the room that can sit down and sit there and agree to stop the slaughter and to work together to do the same thing to the Middle East desert that China has done to the Western desert in their country? Well, as Trump and Xi Jinping announced this framework for constructive Chinese-U.S. relationships of strategic stability, the more positive bilateral signal in years, I think. The congressional Democrats responded not to the substance of the trip, but attacking Trump for doing it at all. Now, I don't want to go into much more about that. I just think it just needs to be kept in. Remember, these people are employees of AIPAC. They're employees of the Zionists. Now, not every Jew is a Zionist. Not every Zionist is a Jew. The Zionists are the ones who want greater Israel, Eretz Israel. That's going to go from the Euphrates down to the Nile, include large portions of Jordan, bringing that entire area right up to the border of Iraq. And the greatest goal of greater Israel is the greater extinction and elimination of Iran. And that's kind of the situation we're in, because the Zionists who propose that, the billionaire Zionists, are the ones who pretty well own Congress. What do I mean by own Congress? Look at the amounts of money these people get from AIPAC for re-election. Apparently it doesn't matter how good of a job you do for the citizens of your district. If you don't have enough money to continue to buy their support, then you haven't got a chance of re-election. So I've got several more things here that I want to bring to your attention. But the thing I'm the most concerned about is that while Tehran says it doesn't trust Washington, it maintains that the standoff cannot be resolved through military means. Now, we know that the U.S. and Israel are actively preparing for a renewal of hostilities with Iran and could resume attacks as early as this week, as is reported in the New York Times. I don't know if you have been following this and what they published of what Kagan published. And these indirect negotiations, oh, yeah, Sammer, yeah. Guess who's going to be greeting Putin personally at the airport tomorrow? Yeah, Xi Jinping. He didn't greet Trump, but he's going to greet Putin. And Putin's going to go into China right after Trump has left. Well, Trump has already left. Putin's going to be there later this week. What do you suppose they're talking about? Now, the indirect negotiations between Iran and the Trump White House have obviously remained deadlocked since this fragile ceasefire was established. I think it was all the way back in April. I'm sure it is. And following over, a month of hostilities prior to that, both sides have repeatedly dismissed the other's demands as unrealistic. Both Tehran and Washington still insist they hold the upper hand. But who's controlling the Strait of Hormuz, which was wide open before the attacks began? And while Iran has announced its own mechanism to regulate maritime traffic in the waterway, Washington has rejected what Iran says they want to do by enforcing a naval blockade at the Iranian ports in retaliation. So two unnamed Middle East officials told the New York Times the other day, Friday, that preparations for new strikes by Israel and the U.S. have greatly accelerated over the past few days, and the conflict could resume as early as this week. Now, the options include more aggressive bombing runs against Iranian military targets and infrastructure sites, and the anonymous U.S. officials told the newspaper, New York Times, another option involves staging a raid to seize Tehran's enriched uranium stockpile that they believe is buried underground in the aftermath of the June bombing of the Iranian nuclear facilities last summer. Now, President Trump has repeatedly threatened to renew the attack on Iran increasingly voicing his dissatisfaction with Tehran's proposals. So then Trump tore into Iran's response to an American proposal last weekend, branding it as a piece of garbage and slamming the current ceasefire as unbelievably weak. These things that just come flying out of Trump's mouth. Tehran says it's ready to deliver a well-deserved response to any aggression. It has expressed some wariness about the stalled negotiations, but shown willingness to engage in diplomacy nonetheless. But the foreign minister Araghchi said this Friday, "We have every reason not to trust the Americans. There is no military solution, and the U.S. must understand this reality. They cannot achieve their goals through military action. But the situation would be different if they would pursue diplomacy." Well, when you've got diplomats on both sides sitting down, banging their heads together, it's very difficult to make any further progression past that point. All right, so we're coming up here towards the end. I just want to mention for a brief moment, I have, actually, I'm going to have to end the stream at this point. Maybe I can, I've got something brewing in the background back there that needs some attention. I just want to mention the half-off special is still going on. I'm telling you, in the days ahead, if this thing gets any worse, and not just gasoline prices, everything that revolves around gasoline and diesel continue to increase, continue to explode, there's very little that we can do in those days to handle emergencies. So I'm going to end the stream right now. And